Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Pannobhasa, also known by other names like John David Reynolds and even other names besides that, some of them so secret that even I myself do not utter them. And I guess we better get to the question answering because as usual I've got quite a few and there's some good ones here, including the first two questions from Fred. And these are short questions with long answers, so brace yourself, prepare yourself, and maybe you should even go pee. Pause this, go pee, come back, and then start watching, because there's going to be some serious question answering here. And Fred's first question, with the short question but a long answer, is what's your thoughts on Abhidhamma? And a lot of people probably don't even know what Abhidhamma is, even though it is the third basket of the Tipitaka, the Buddhist scriptures. In many sects, including Theravada, are called the Tipitaka or the Tripitaka, depending on whether the scriptural language is Pali or Sanskrit. And Tipitaka means literally three baskets. The first basket is the Vinaya, or the rules of monastic discipline for monks and also nuns. The second is the Suttanta, which is mainly dialogues of the Buddha, or sometimes it's like sermons of the Buddha, or dialogues, or sometimes sermons by some of the Buddha's chief disciples or enlightened disciples. And then finally, the third Pitaka is the Abhidhamma Pitaka, in Sanskrit Abhidharma. And in Burma, they consider the Abhidhamma to be the most important part of the Buddhist teachings, although most Westerners, probably more than 2/3 of Western monks, for example, just don't believe it. They do not consider it to be authentic. They do not consider it to be genuine teachings of the Buddha. And I was one of those, and I still really have very little use for Abhidhamma. As a general rule, the less Abhidhamma you know, the better, because the less you have to unlearn in order to really understand the truth. I think Venerable Jnanavira, an English monk who lived back in the 50s and 60s, who was ordained as a monk back in the 50s and 60s in Sri Lanka, he's the one who I think originally said that, just the less you know the better, because the more you learn of Abhidhamma, the more you have to unlearn in order to get back on the right track again. And the very first essay that I wrote, way back before I had a computer or anything, I was writing the way cave people did, with a pen on paper. And the first appendix, I had some appendixes at the end. The first appendix was Appendix 1, some evidence suggesting the spurious nature of Abhidhamma philosophy. And I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just go over the main points, the main arguments, explaining why Abhidhamma probably wasn't really taught by the Buddha. So the first point here is that in the only canonical account of the first Buddhist council, which is Vinaya Chulawaga chapter 12, it says that the Venerable Upali recited the Vinaya, and then the Venerable Ananda recited the suttas, and that was it. There's no mention at all of Abhidhamma. Even in the canonical account of the second council, there's no mention at all of Abhidhamma. So really there's no contemporary or anything close to contemporary mentions of the Abhidhamma Pitaka until you get up around the third council, which is like mid-3rd century BC, and so well over 100 years after the lifetime of the Buddha. And let's see, I don't want to miss out on any good points here, but let's see. Yeah, the Burmese account for this, and also the commentarial tradition accounts for this by just saying that Abhidhamma was, or they just change the details of the story and say Ananda also recited Abhidhamma, even though there's no mention of it in the oldest accounts. And then the Burmese just lump Abhidhamma in with the Khuddaka Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka, which is still not very convincing. Okay, so the second point, describing the reasons or the evidence suggesting that Abhidhamma really wasn't taught by the Buddha, is that the word Abhidhamma is seldom found in the rest of the Tipitaka, approximately 11 times. I think I read somewhere that the word Abhidhamma is found 11 times in the Vinaya and the Suttanta Pitakas. And when it is found, it's usually paired with the word Abhivinaya, like it'll have monks discussing Abhidhamma and Abhivinaya, which indicates, or at least strongly suggests, that here it didn't really mean the Abhidhamma Pitaka because there was no Abhivinaya Pitaka. It just means like higher points or like fine points of Dhamma, fine points of Vinaya. And that probably somehow evolved into sort of a commentary, which then became very elaborate and became like orthodox dogma. And then finally, by the time of the Third Council, it just got incorporated. Let's see, the third point is that many of the terms which play integral central roles in Abhidhamma philosophy, like Cetasika, Cetaviti, Bhavanga, Javana, Kriya Chitta, Rupa Kalapa, etc., are either entirely lacking in the suttas or are found there rarely and in radically different contexts. For example, the elaborate doctrine of Cetaviti, which is essential traditional Abhidhamma psychology and is taught in even the most elementary of Abhidhamma courses, is entirely foreign to the first two Pitakas and is mentioned only briefly and obscurely even in the Abhidhamma Pitaka itself, because a lot of what is considered to be basic teachings of Abhidhamma that you learn in like a beginning course of Abhidhamma, like someplace like Burma, that's from the commentaries. It's from the Abhidhamma commentaries, because by the time the Tipitaka was closed, Abhidhamma wasn't finished yet. They were still working on it. So a lot of the basic teachings of Abhidhamma are found not in the Pitaka, in the Abhidhamma Pitaka itself, not in the actual canonical scriptures, but in the commentaries to the scriptures. So moving on to the next point, the fifth book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka is called the Kata Watu, which is based entirely on dogmatic controversies with schismatic sects of Buddhism that existed around the time of the Third Council. So the most obvious or most likely explanation for the Kata Watu is that it was written around the time of the Third Council, or composed around the time of the Third Council. Although the Burmese will say that the Buddha could see the future and he was like giving ways of arguing against heretics. You know, he would see what the arguments would be by looking into the future and then explain ways of arguing against them. But the arguments are like proto-logical. You know, they're not very good arguments in a lot of cases. And I think the Buddha could have done a lot better if this explanation were the correct one. So let's see. The fifth one is really the clincher for most academics. I think most Western Buddhist scholars just have to admit, you know, just as they would admit that Mahayana didn't exist for the first few hundred years of Buddhism, by the same token, they have to admit that Abhidhamma probably didn't exist for the first more than 100 years of Buddhism. And the clincher is that of the different schools of ancient Buddhism, and by the time of the Third Council, there were lots of them, you know, up into double digits. Each one had its own Abhidhamma. It was like the Vinaya and the Suttas are relatively the same amongst all of the oldest sects. But the Abhidhamma Pitaka is radically different. I mean, it's like the Sarvastivadin school of Buddhism is relatively closely connected or closely related to Theravada. I think probably Sarvastivada and Theravada didn't really officially split into two different schools of Buddhism until around the time of the Third Council. And even so, their Abhidhammas are entirely different. Not a single book is the same. So with regard to Vinaya and the suttas, among the ancient schools, they were mostly in agreement. I'd guess, maybe 80% the same at least. The same suttas, the same rules, that kind of a thing. But with Abhidhamma, it's just almost completely different. So that's really the clincher for most of the scholars, and for me also. I mean, it really does. It's like the final nail in the coffin. Although I move on to another point here that just a lot of Abhidhamma just really, it's just there's objectively untrue. Going with modern science, for example, like in Abhidhamma, they just have like an ultimately real essence called nutritive essence. So that's like nutrition is just this one element. And of course, I mean, there's all kinds of different aspects to nutrition. Like a hydrogen atom. I mean, if it's in a molecule of glucose, it's a nutritive, or I guess nowadays maybe people who think that sugar is poison would say it isn't. But let's say it's in a molecule of vitamin C, ascorbic acid, then it would be nutritive. But that same hydrogen atom, if it's in a molecule of some sort of toxin, then of course it's non-nutritive. It's toxic. So. But even so, in Abhidhamma, this nutritive essence, it's like ultimately small particle. It'd be no bigger than a hydrogen atom. So, I mean, there's just all this stuff. I mean, I don't want to just flog a dead horse here, but there's lots and lots of evidence. And to most objective outsiders who are knowledgeable in Buddhism, it's pretty conclusive evidence that the Buddha really didn't teach Abhidhamma. And even the story explaining how Abhidhamma existed is pretty fishy, like the origin of Abhidhamma. The official story or myth is that one year during the rains retreat, the Buddha left a kind of holographic image of himself on earth, and he flew up into a heaven realm and taught the gods there Abhidhamma. And so gradually it came back to earth, and there was some delay, presumably, or it was kept secret. It was just like higher teachings or something. And that kind of explains, probably it's an answer to monks long ago who were saying, why is it all of a sudden there's these new, genuine, authentic teachings of the Buddha that we'd never heard of before? So that would be their way of answering the question, much like the origin story of Mahayana Buddhism, where according to the legend, and this is the same kind of legend, it's just this kind of lame explanatory legend of how authentic teachings of the Buddha can just suddenly crop up hundreds of years after the death of the Buddha. According to the Mahayana legends, the Buddha realized that people just weren't wise enough to understand Mahayana, and so the Mahayana scriptures were hidden under the ocean in a kind of palace and guarded by Naga serpent dragons until around the time of Nagarjuna, like 500 years after the time of the Buddha. It's the same kind of story. It's just a myth explaining how all of a sudden you can have new, authentic, ancient teachings of the Buddha that nobody had heard of before. So, I mean, to make a long story or a long answer even longer, my thoughts on Abhidhamma is that it was kind of like an old commentary that became canonical. It was so old that it just, its origins were lost in the mists of time, and it just became canonical, or something along those lines. But as I say, most of the different ancient schools of Buddhism had their own Abhidhamma. There were a few that didn't have any Abhidhamma at all. So it's hardly likely that all of the schools of Buddhism except one would throw out the most important teachings of the Buddha and then cook up like fake ones. So I'll just move on to Fred's next question. That was a long answer to a short question. This one will be a slightly shorter answer to a slightly longer question. What's your opinion on transferring merit? Is there an energy field matrix in a being? Okay, transferring merit. It happens a lot in Theravada Buddhism. At least it is attempted a lot. And what you're trying to do is, it's mainly has to do with ancestors or just helping unhappy spirits, people who have passed away, and you're not sure if they've got enough merit to get into heaven, to get a good rebirth or something. So you're trying to help them by contributing to their merit so that they'll have enough good karma to make it into a better realm. And so usually what they do in Asia or in Burma especially is they'll go to a monastery and they'll take precepts, they'll donate things to the monks, and listen to a sermon. And then at the end, they will do a water pouring ceremony where they're sharing their merit, the merit that they have just earned by, making the donations and hearing the Dhamma and keep taking the precepts, and they're sharing that merit with all beings. But there is no energy transfer, really. They're not just shooting rays of good karma in all directions. What happens is, according to Orthodox Theravada anyway, the beings that are going to benefit have to be present or have to be able to know what's going on. So generally it only works for ghosts, spirits, petas, who can actually be there and witness what's going on. And then what happens is that, they rejoice. They're happy that these people are doing these good things. And then because they are happy that someone else is doing something good, that is a wholesome mental state for them, which then raises their amount of merit. So you don't just take your own merit and send it to somebody else. You earn merit, and then other beings see you earning merit, and then they're happy because they see you earning merit, and then their own happiness is their merit. So that's generally how it works, or how it's supposed to work anyway. And so, as I say, it generally only works for ghosts, according to Orthodox Theravada, or any being who can actually witness what's going on. If they're in hell, they're not going to be able to see it. If they're in heaven, they don't really need the merit anyway, presumably. And heaven is so much better than here that they're generally not interested, and they're not paying attention to what we're doing. So mostly it works for spirits. So I'll just move on to the next question here, which is from Baron Sinclair. And Baron Sinclair says, is a bhikkhu allowed to exercise for health, such as yoga asanas, yogic postures, calisthenics, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, etc., or cardio, which he has running? I am currently a gym instructor in training, but plan to ordain as a monk in the coming years after I work for a while. I feel like I need to be able to do more than just alms round and walking meditation for exercise. I have discovered that my body simply requires a workout to stay physically attuned. Okay, that's kind of a good question, I think. Kind of an interesting one, possibly a useful one to a few of you who are maybe considering becoming a monk but want to exercise, stay healthy. It depends on what the purpose of your exercise is. If you're doing it to be buff, if you're doing it for sport, then it's a no-no. You're not supposed to do it. Like, there is actually a rule against playing in water, which would include swimming if you don't have a real need to swim. Like, if it's the only way to cross a river, then you're allowed to swim. Or if you're getting away from like an angry elephant or something, then yeah, you can swim. You're in a flood or something. But exercising in order to look good, that is contrary to Dhamma, especially for a monk. It's not so bad for a layperson, but monks are really, just the purity of your life will keep you healthy. And if you want exercise, then you can live a long way from your alms village, your alms resort, do a lot of walking, lots of chop wood, carry water kind of a stuff. And I was relatively healthy when I was a monk living out in the woods. To some degree, just the roughness of living that lifestyle has like your caveman instincts going, and it maybe raises your testosterone or something. So I was actually pretty fit as a monk when I was living in the forest anyway. So that would probably be your best bet. I mean, running, yeah, that's not going to go over. Especially if you're living in an Asian culture, a traditional Asian culture, they're not going to people are going to think it's very inappropriate for monks to be jogging or like lifting weights or doing calisthenics out in public, in the privacy of your own hut. Then yeah, you can do push-ups, sit-ups, that kind of a thing. There's nothing wrong with that, so long as you're doing it just for health and not for the purpose of looking good or for just sport. And there are the four recollections that monks are supposed to recollect. One of them is before they eat food. They're supposed to recollect, I'm eating this food not to look good, not to beautify myself, not for pleasure, but only to keep this body healthy enough that I can continue practicing Dhamma. And exercise would be similar to that. So it would have to be low key, probably in solitude, no jogging. I mean, good luck jogging with monk's robes anyway. So, yeah, I mean, it's not entirely against the rules, but you'd have to examine your motives, and also you should probably consider just the cultural norms of a Buddhist country if you're living in one, or just the cultural norms of the people who are supporting you. So the next question is from somebody who has no name other than just a horizontal line. And the horizontal line says, what is your opinion of Advaita Vedanta? I like Buddhism very much, except for its doctrine of the Anatman, or no self, and its vision of consciousness. I find Adi Shankara's arguments for the Atman and nature of consciousness more convincing, but I'm a bit divided because for everything else I prefer Buddhism. This is a theme that I address relatively frequently, maybe not every single Q&A, but probably more than half of them. I touch upon this idea that you've got an absolute, this formless, infinite absolute. And in Vedanta, it's called Brahman. In Buddhism, it's called Nirvana, usually, or Nibbana Dhatu. And they're trying to explain the same thing. I think anybody with an open mind who's not just a complete dogmatist would be inclined to agree that like the ultimate reality that the Upanishads are attempting to describe is essentially the same ultimate reality that Buddhist texts are attempting to describe, except they have to they go about it differently. And really, you've got this problem in that an absolute is unconditioned. I mean, anything you say about it is going to be invalid, because once you start explaining it, you've got an explanation. You're no longer anywhere near the absolute anymore, philosophically speaking. So you've got this ultimate, this absolute, and you can't say that it exists, and you can't say that it doesn't exist. You can't say that it does and doesn't exist. You can't say that it neither does nor doesn't exist. Anything you say about it is going to be invalid. But nevertheless, human language and just the human thought process requires us to have some kind of handle to deal with it. And so most religions take the absolute and say it exists. And a lot of them will just call it God. But in Buddhism, they just took the other invalid option of saying it doesn't exist, or at least usually Buddhism treats nirvana as just kind of emptiness or void, something like that. The principle of cessation is a common explanation in Theravada for nibbana. And so it's just like either way is wrong. I mean, either way is invalid. But you have to pick one or the other as a general rule. So if you prefer that to believe that the absolute is, then be a theist or a Vedantist. And if you want to say that it isn't, then be a Buddhist. And the Buddhist idea of isn't, it's much less prone to attachment to dogmas. I mean, still people get attached to Buddhist dogmas, but still isn't for the absolute. It can lead to nihilism and materialism, and a lot of people accuse the Buddhists of being nihilists. But really, it's you just experience it for yourself and then stop trying to stick labels onto it. That would be your best bet. Consciousness, yeah, it's like in the Vedanta or the Upanishads, the highest principle is sometimes described as infinite formless consciousness. Whereas in Theravada, usually consciousness is just a mental state. There has to be consciousness of something. It's just like a mundane mental state usually. But there are at least 2 suttas that contain fragments of really old Buddhist poetry that do describe Nibbana as infinite consciousness. But as I say, trying to stick any kind of label onto it, you've already missed the boat. Just trying to conceptualize it, you're already gone into the realm of invalidity. So you just don't think about it. Like the original, like the oldest Buddhist text, like the Atagawaga of the Sutta Nipata, you just don't think about it. Don't theorize, you just practice. And then you experience it directly if your practice reaches the goal. And you just don't worry about it. Just don't try to, don't try to write on the air, it just doesn't work. So the horizontal line asks another question here. What do you think of Tibetan Buddhism? They almost join the Vedantic vision in some thinkers, even if officially they still reject the Atman of the Indians, quote unquote. I think, for example, the Dol Popa, whose description of the absolute would be validated by any Vedantic thinker. I really don't know that much about Tibetan Buddhism. I've never been that much attracted to it. When I became a Buddhist, I just wanted to know what the Buddha taught and to follow that. And Theravada comes closest to that. It's historically comes closest to the Buddha's time. So you're going to find like a higher percentage of authentic teachings in the Pali texts than you're going to find in later schools, just because the other schools are later than Theravada. But the key here is, I think, for example, of Dol Popa, whose description of the absolute could be validated. Well, there you go. That's it. Description of the absolute. There is no valid description of the absolute. Once you start describing the absolute, it's not the absolute anymore. It's just absolute. It's just this label. It's just this unenlightened concept in your mind, which is just infinitely far away from what you're trying to describe. So the Buddhists are better at not reifying the absolute. If you just absolutely can't stand not reifying the absolute and like theorizing about it and explaining it and sticking labels onto it as though that were possible, then yeah, you might feel more comfortable with a more theistic system. So I think I should just move on. I'm answering these questions rather long-windedly. Next question is from Trumptonshire Gahapati. And Trumptonshire Gahapati says, can you provide any citations for traditional Buddhist views on homosexuality? The context for this question is that I did some searching on the papers available on academia.edu, but all I found were left-wing academics writing what appeared to be tendentious papers about Buddhism being so supportive of homosexuality. Yeah, that's not surprising at all. With regard to Buddhism and homosexuality, Buddhism certainly is not all black and white like a lot of religions, especially Western religions. I mean, it's like something is a sin or it's not a sin. You know, if you do this, you'll go to hell, or you won't go to hell. Maybe you'll go to heaven. But in Buddhism, it just doesn't work that way. Buddhist ethics are psychological. So two people can do exactly the same thing, and one person will be doing something wholesome and the other person will be doing something unwholesome. And, I'll spare you the same example that I give of, the frog and the snake, and you chase them away. Well, I guess I'm not sparing you, am I? So you're walking through the forest, you see a frog being constricted by a snake is trying to swallow this frog. The frog is squealing and struggling, trying to get away. So you chase the snake away. And if you did it out of compassion for the frog, you did something wholesome. And if you did do it out of aversion for the snake, you did something unwholesome, even though the action is exactly the same. The exact same action can be good or bad depending on the mental states accompanying the action. And so Theravada Buddhist ethics, it's not all black and white. And it's not just this action is good and that action is bad. In fact, it's almost all within the realm of gray. You just got various shades of gray. And just pure white action is virtually impossible. Pure black, unwholesome action is virtually impossible. There's always going to be some shade of gray involved. And homosexuality is gray. The only citations like in the canonical text that I can remember. I don't remember if there's any mention in the suttas. I wouldn't be surprised if there is. But homosexuals arguably are not allowed to be ordained as monks. And the reason for that is not that they are necessarily bad. It's just sort of going with statistics that they were considered to be more likely to be depraved. And it's not just homosexuals, it was also eunuchs. In fact, it was mostly eunuchs that the rule applied to. But in Buddhist philosophy or just ancient Indian culture, anyone who wasn't considered fully male or fully female, anyone who was in between male and female, like fully one or fully the other, would be called a panduka, which was the word usually used for eunuchs. But apparently homosexuals, and to some degree even bisexuals, could be considered not quite fully male, and at least psychologically. And they were considered to be more likely to be like aberrant and to some degree even depraved. And I mean, there is some medical support for this. I've read in a medical journal, or not a medical journal, but a diagnostic guide, a doctor's diagnostic guide, I think it was the Merck guide, that it is not uncommon for a homosexual man to have had more than 1,000 sexual partners in his lifetime. So there is something backing that up. But with getting back to just homosexuality itself, really it's the mental states. So it can be light gray or dark gray depending on the mental states. I guess that would be the best way of putting it. But with Buddhism, and because it was based on ancient Indian spiritual traditions, all sexuality is considered to be at least slightly immoral. Even if two people are married, they still have sex. I mean, if they're experiencing lust and attachment and all that, then there's going to be at least a little bit of akusala kama involved. And that's one reason why, unlike in many other religions, probably most other religions, weddings are just not religious in a Theravada Buddhist country especially, because it is just strictly against the rules for a monk to even participate in a wedding. And if he does, he's committed a serious offense. He has to take penance for 6 days and 6 nights. So homosexuality, it's not necessarily, just the act itself, just setting aside the statistics and the general trends of ancient India and the beliefs and all this, it just depends on the mental states. It could be more or less unwholesome than heterosexual sex, depending on the mental states. You know, how inflamed with lust and attachment and so forth you are would determine, going with traditional Buddhist ethics, how unethical it is. So, in a way, that's kind of, Buddhism goes much easier on homosexuality than like the Western religions do, as a general rule. Like Dante's Inferno had its own circle just for homosexuals. They had those like flaming napalm raining down on their naked bodies forever and ever. So the next questions are similar, so I'll just move on. And so the next questions are from someone whose name is in Japanese characters, but according to Google Translate, it transliterates as Yuichiro. And so, assuming that that is the person's actual name, then Yuichiro asks the question, is sodomy, quote unquote, sexual misconduct? Now that's, in a way, it's almost a trick question, because sexual misconduct, going with just the standard description of sexual misconduct, it mainly means having sexual relations with somebody who is not a free agent, somebody who is living under the protection or under the obligation of somebody else. So sexual misconduct, just in the standard Theravadan tradition, just has a list of different kinds of females, because apparently it was directed towards men primarily, although women could kind of take the male counterparts of these. And it would just be like a woman who's still, like a woman who's married, who would be like a ward of her husband in India at the time, or a woman who is engaged, betrothed, a woman who is like a slave of somebody else, a woman who was a prisoner, like a female convict or something, who would be like a ward of the state or a ward of the warden or whatever. So sodomy doesn't really fit into that category. I mean, technically, if a man and a woman, they like Greek love or something, that it doesn't really talk about it much. Not that I can remember, if at all, this sort of thing. So again, you just go back to mental states. If you have more lust, more attachment, then going with ancient Indian Buddhist ethics, then the more attachment and clinging and like agitation of mind and so forth, the worse it would be. So yeah, it's just another shade of gray. And I'm going to move on to the next question by Yuichiro here, which is an easy one. Finally, I get an easy question to answer. Should sodomites be burned at the stake, imprisoned, or legally punished? And going with Buddhism, no. I mean, everyone's karma is their own, and people have the right, to, at least to some degree, to live naughty lives. It really is your own choice, and so there's no need to punish people for that from the Buddhist point of view, because your own actions, your own actions are your karma, especially the mental actions. And so, I mean, if there is any punishment due, it's going to come back on you. It's just a natural process. There's no need for police to interfere or anything like that, unless it's really a case of people harming other people, and then you gotta, the king has to do something, the police have to do something. But with regard to something like this, so long as it's not rape or child abuse or something like that, then it's not necessarily any worse than any other kind of sexuality. So next question from Yuichiro is, if there is a loving monogamous relationship between two men, would you consider that immoral or against nature, or in some other way inferior to normal relationships besides its non-reproductive nature? If they abstain from sexual activity, would that make it better? Well, I think I've already answered the first part, because really it just depends on the mental states that determine how good or how bad an action is. And so just moving around to the last part here, if they abstain from sexual activity, would that make it better? And yeah, like I've already implied, that from the ancient Indian Buddhist ethical world, ethical universe, then yeah, celibacy is better than sex, because of the desires and so forth that arise during sex. So maybe sort of going off the tracks a little, and bringing up Jesus of Nazareth, he was saying there are three kinds of eunuchs: those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs, and those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And the third kind is people who are celibate for religious reasons. And then he said, it's just not for everybody. Not everybody can be celibate. You can be celibate and then just be like frustrated and horny all the time, which is still mental states, it's sexual mental states. So in some cases, if they were able to be happily celibate, then from the traditional Buddhist point of view, then yeah, that would make it better. But as I say, that's not for everybody. And as Jesus said too, allegedly. So I'll just move on to the next one here. This is the last question from Yuichiro. In your article on karmic minimalism, were you discouraging merit? Certain things like meditation, teaching Dharma, and supporting your community are considered merit. Don't monks do this? Aren't monks supposed to be more morally perfected? Okay, that's a good question. That's a fair question. There is a little confusion here, it seems like, though. Like, with regard to meditation, it is true that people, especially like Burmese lay people, consider that you earn merit through meditation. And if you're practicing an elementary level of meditation, that may be the case. But as I say, karma, good karma and bad karma, depend on mental states, like perceptual, volitional mental states. And if you're meditating really well, you don't have no perceptual or volitional mental states, other than just maybe very, very subtle and refined ones, which means that your karma is very, very subtle and refined. It's it's getting close to zero. So you can call it merit, but again, what I was referring to in the article is karmic minimalism, which means making as little karma as possible. And through meditation, you make less karma than if you're not meditating. So that's karmic minimalism. And that's not the kind of merit I was talking about. With regard to teaching Dharma, again, it's mental states. This is an issue I bring up probably every single Q&A, that people just kind of get locked into this Western utilitarian ethic. It's like, is doing this right or is doing this wrong? And it's mental states. It's the attitude that you have when you're doing something. So if you can teach Dharma with just equanimity, maybe you're just mindfully watching your mouth move and hearing the sounds coming out of your mouth, then you could call that merit, I suppose, but you're not making much karma at all. And that's the point of karmic minimalism, is to make as little karma as possible. Supporting your community, for monks, no. The community of monks, yeah, they should support each other, but they're not supposed to be involved in like village politics or village welfare projects or anything like that, because that's karma. Or at least it is if you've got mental states going while you're doing it. So don't monks do this? Yeah. Most monks are sloppy monks. Most monks are not really conscientiously trying to follow what the texts say monks are supposed to do. So in Asia, especially, monks are village priests and marriage counselors and sort of village psychoanalysts or something. There's a lot of them. Some of the famous monks in Burma, they're collecting donations, and then they're like building hospitals and that sort of thing, which is all very good. But then again, monks aren't supposed to be doing that. Merit is for lay people, or at least merit in the form of good karma is for lay people, because monks really are supposed to have as little karma as possible, good or bad. So let's see, last question here from Yuichiro, or the last part of the last question. Aren't monks supposed to be more morally perfected? Sure, but moral perfection is neutral. Buddhist ethics are neutral. I mean, you look at the precepts, it's all don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. It's not you should do something, it's just neutrality. It's like karmic minimalism again. So that's the moral perfection of a Buddhist, is he's down to, the moral perfection of a Buddhist would be like zero karma. Okay, next question is from Era Fascista. And Era Fascista says, you've probably been asked this 1,000 times, but what are some good books for somebody interested in learning about Buddhism? All right, with regard to just an intro, like a primer on Buddhism, probably the best one I've read, and I haven't read a whole lot, but probably the best one I read would be What the Buddha Taught by Walpola Rahula, and I don't have a copy of it, so I can't really show you. But on the other hand, if you really want to know what like early Buddhism was like, what Buddhism was originally like, your best bet is to read ancient texts, like good translations of ancient texts. And probably the text that converted me to Theravada Buddhism would be the Sutta Nipata. And I got one copy of it here. This is Pali Text Society. K.R. Norman's translation. Not the best possible translation, but it's very literal. He's like a linguist. So, I mean, reading the Sutta Nipata, if you have a good translation, that would be a good thing to do. Or this would be a good intro if you really want to understand what early Buddhism was like. This is a translation of the Majjhima Nikaya by Nyanamoli and Bhikkhu Bodhi. And although Bhikkhu Bodhi is a totally unhinged leftist at this point politically, he still remains one of the best translators of Pali texts into English. And another book that you can get free, I'm pretty sure, from various publishers, is Jnanatiloka's Buddhist Dictionary. I mean, this is good for understanding the terminology and the philosophical jargon of Buddhism. So this is, I mean, any serious student of Buddhism should probably try to get a copy of this. And if you're more advanced, you really want like a radical explanation of what the earliest Buddhism was likely to be like. One of the most important books I've ever read is this one, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey. And he takes more or less of a Vedantist approach because he is a Brahmin, a Hindu. And so he kind of interprets things along Vedantist lines. But still, I mean, it's really good. But if you don't know the difference between the Samyutta Nikaya and the Anguttara Nikaya, a lot of this is just going to seem like Greek, because he just assumes that you already understand a lot of the terminology and understand the Pali texts to some degree. And another kind of interesting one, if you can get this one, this is kind of surreal. It's just like a mind blower of a book, but it's the Manuals of Buddhism by Ledi Sayadaw, who was one of the most famous Burmese monks of, say, 100 or more years ago. And it's got all kinds of really strange stuff in there that will give you a very interesting and surreal approach to Orthodox Theravada, because he was also very orthodox. So those are the best ones I can think of, at least with regard to Theravada. The book that converted me to Buddhism to begin with would be Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, which of course is a Zen book. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is a strange one, by someone with a strange name, Flora Fulgurator. And Flora Fulgurator's question is, what is the best thing the Buddha or Buddhism said about fire? Which is a strange question because, fire does get mentioned in the texts, but it's usually in a negative context, just as something destructive, as like a parable or a simile for something that is destructive, or also with regard to enlightenment itself, nirvana. So, like the Buddha's third sermon, according to tradition, was called the fire sermon, where he's just saying the whole world is in flames, the whole world is burning. That's sort of the negative aspect of it. And a more neutral aspect would be the whole concept of nirvana, which is based on the understanding of fire. Nirvana, in all likelihood, with all due respects to Ajahn Tanisaro, it means blowing out. Like the verb form is nibayadi, and that means blowing out. And in really ancient texts, there is like the simile of the fire when it blows out. Where does it go? It just enters like a formless, unconditioned state. Because in ancient India, fire was a god. It was Agni, the messenger of the gods. It was in a sense divine. And so if you blew out a fire, it didn't die. It just became formless and unconditioned in a sense. And that was like a metaphor for understanding nirvana. So maybe that's the best thing the Buddha said about fire. He just compared enlightenment or nirvana to the going out of a fire or the blowing out of a fire. But I can't think of any case where the Buddha was actually sitting around praising fire. Maybe he did. Maybe there's some obscure discourse where the Buddha is listing off the 6 beneficial qualities of fire or something. But I can't think of that, what it would be. So I move on to the next question from Samayam. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them. Samayam. And Samayam's question here: there is more than one way to deal with external, maybe also internal difficulties, delusion, problems, dealing with reality, truth, etc. Walking away or engage are the 2 main ones that everyone does. What about a natural balance to this, as an ebb and flow of what is instinctually necessary, but at the same time mindful? Where is that balance for everyone? Well, I mean, I've written about this before in an essay called One of Many Middle Paths. And in that I was discussing like the middle path between running away from problems and just going out looking for problems. You don't have to look for problems. You don't have to like deliberately accelerate, crap happening to you, because it's going to happen. And so long as you have the maturity to deal with it mindfully with some equanimity, then you should let it happen. I mean, if you just know yourself well enough to know that you can't deal with this situation without freaking out, then it's probably best to, withdraw until you're stronger. And it's sort of like just dealing with temptation in general. If you can resist the temptation, then you strengthen yourself by meeting the temptation and resisting it. But if you know that you're just going to cave and give into the temptation, then your best bet is to avoid the temptation until you are stronger. But just running away from anything unpleasant is not going to make you stronger. It's sort of like the Howard Hughes approach. It's like he had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and he was just trying to, because he was very rich, of course, he was trying to just humor all of these obsessive like compulsions. And so, at the end, I mean, he was just like a hermit. He wouldn't cut his fingernails. He would only eat certain prepackaged foods that were handed to him by servants with, like plastic gloves on and this kind of a thing. And it just made him weaker and weaker in certain ways because, he wasn't standing up to the temptation. He was just giving into it every time. So, yeah, I think I might be talking too much on this one, but really, I mean, if there is like these difficulties, you shouldn't go out looking for them necessarily, but if they come at you, and they certainly will, because that's what this world is, then if you are strong enough to deal with it wisely, then do so, and that will make you even wiser. But if you know yourself well enough to know that you're just going to freak out or it's going to mess you up or something, then you need to, like skillfully retreat, and work on it maybe with lesser cases, easier, do the bunny slope a little more until you're better at it. And then next time it happens, maybe you'll be strong enough to deal with it. And I'm not sure if I'm even answering Samayam's question here correctly in accordance with what he meant, but that's my shot at it. So I'll move on to Samayam's next question. What would a traditional Buddhist say about humans flying into outer space or to other planets' moons? I've never heard a traditional Buddhist say anything about such things. I don't think there's anything necessarily opposed to traditional Buddhism in that idea, because Buddhism does admit that there are an infinite number of worlds. It's not like Christianity, which says there's just this planet Earth in the center of the universe, and God made all the stars just so that sailors can navigate, using the stars at night, that kind of a thing. It's just an infinite number of worlds, and I don't think there's necessarily anything preventing someone in a spaceship leaving this world and arriving in another one. But some Burmese scholar monk might correct me on that. So I'll just move on to the next one, also by Samayam. Well-established toxic fertilizer chemicals can be hidden in foods and even passed on and propagated through seeds in farming. Some plants may be chemically altered through several generations, if not for our whole lifetime. According to traditional Buddhist thinking, how would karma play out for the monk who ate this food? Well, again, the karma is a matter of mental states. And it may be that you could eat that food with no different mental states than if the food were just wild type, not genetically modified in any way, or no chemical fertilizers used in any way. So, the question would be like, if there are some sort of results coming from the fertilizer or the genetic modification, like you get some sort of health problem, then going with the Buddhist idea, that would be the fruition of karma for the most part. And it would be a matter of your mental states, and it would be more a matter of your mental states than a matter of genetic modification of the plants you ate. So Abhidhamma scholars do claim that every feeling that arises in you arises through the power of karma. It's the fruition of karma, kama vipaka. And there are people who will say otherwise, but I've known enough Abhidhamma scholars in Burma to know what they say, and that's what they say. So it'd be a matter of like your mental states, and it's just not an issue in traditional Buddhism. Like I said earlier, like nutritive essence is just one ultimately real, like an atom, subatomic particle that they just didn't understand. There's no refined understanding of nutrition or biochemistry, anything like that in the Buddhist texts. So they look at it more from a religious point of view, and if you get sick, it's maybe you ate bad food or something, but still it's your karma's involved. And it's your karma more than the chemicals that are going to make you happy or unhappy. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is one that I get asked every once in a while. And it is an interesting question. What do you think about individual or collective manifestation of karma that impacts the mass population, possibly creating a universal karma? What do you think about the differences between individual and collective manifestation? Well, this is sort of like debates about evolution, like natural selection. Some people say natural selection occurs with large groups, entire populations. But orthodox Darwinian evolutionary biology says that natural selection occurs with the individual. Either you survive to reproduce or you die off. And karma is sort of like that also. The orthodox Theravadan explanation is there is no group karma, that karma is always individual. But there can be like what is virtually group karma, in that people with the similar mental states, similar attitudes, similar problems, who are making similar karma tend to be born together. Obviously, if you have certain mental states and you have the karma to live in a certain kind of culture, then other people with that similar kind of karma are going to be born into that culture also. So in a way, you could say that's like group karma, although it's somewhat of an illusion. At least going with Orthodox Theravada. Um, so yeah, I think I answered that one. It's kind of a complex question, but somehow I accidentally answered it succinctly. So I'll move on to the next one. How would a traditional Buddhist address the differences between the conscious and subconscious for himself and for others? Yeah, this is something I've thought about rather a lot, in that Abhidhamma, which is traditional Orthodox Theravada, doesn't really have a concept of the unconscious mind or the subconscious. They've got what's called Bhavanga Chitta, which they call the subconscious, but really that's just like a test pattern. It's like it doesn't change. It's just this one image that is just showing on the screen in your mind, so to speak, if you're completely unconscious, or it's like in between thoughts, that kind of a thing. You're deeply asleep. It can be there a lot. But the whole idea of like the Freudian subconscious, even though to me it seems fairly likely, pretty obvious in fact, that we do have mental states, perceptual states, volitions, motivations that we're not consciously aware of. And Orthodox Theravada really doesn't have much to say about that, which is kind of interesting. So how would a traditional Buddhist address the differences between the conscious and subconscious? They wouldn't, because Orthodox Theravada does not acknowledge the existence of something like a Freudian subconscious, or like Jungian archetypes, the collective unconscious, that kind of a thing. That I could be mistaken, but I'm, like I say, I've lived in Burma for so long and talked with so many Abhidhamma scholars. I got a pretty good idea what Abhidhamma says, and the subconscious mind just somehow, they just didn't think of that. Dreams also is another weird one that Abhidhamma just completely overlooks. So I'll just move on to the next question, also from Samayam, who does not like green eggs and ham. Do traditional Buddhists accept real science or understand enough of it to accept it? Is there any conflict between the belief in Buddhism and real science in this context, according to the Buddhist? Yeah, well, most traditional Buddhists are not really up to date on science. A lot of them are in Asia. They're subsistence farmers and and so forth. And but I mean, they like to believe that Buddhism and science are in agreement. And for the most part, I mean, there's a lot of overlap. Let's just say there's a lot of overlap between like scientific objectivity and empiricism on the one hand and Buddhism on the other. I mean, they're not entirely, it's not a perfect fit. Science doesn't explain ghosts and rebirth and a lot of other things, a lot of the more metaphysical aspects of karma, that kind of a thing. And sometimes they just contradict each other. Like Abhidhamma says consciousness and like thought arises in the heart, and that the brain is like the commentarial tradition, like the Visuddhimagga, just says that the brain is just bone marrow filling a large hollow bone, and they didn't even know what it did. They just almost the only effect of having a brain in the Visuddhimagga is that if you catch a cold, it liquefies and drips out of your nose in the form of snot. So yeah, Buddhism is pre-scientific by a long shot, and it arose 2,500 years ago in the Ganges Valley, and like any other pre-modern religion, it's going to have a pre-modern interpretation of reality. But a lot of it, like the cosmology, the flat earth floating on water and all that is just irrelevant. It doesn't really have anything to do with Buddhist practice anyway. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. I hope I answered that one, but maybe I didn't. Last question from Sam I Am. Could you say that Buddhism as a religion is incomplete? Why or why not? Well, I'm not exactly sure what Sam I Am means here by incomplete. It doesn't explain everything, and then the Buddha in some sermons or some discourses just says, the purpose of Buddhism isn't to explain everything. It's like he holds up a few leaves in his hand and says, what he teaches is like this handful of leaves, even though all there is that could be taught is like all the leaves and the trees in this forest, that they're sitting in. But he's just teaching you the nature of suffering and the way to escape from suffering. And so, with regard to empirical objectivity, it would be very incomplete because, it's a specialized field. It's not trying to explain everything, even though Abhidhamma tries to explain everything and spectacularly fails, in my opinion, because it doesn't even explain gravity, for example. Let's see, incomplete could also mean like if it doesn't get you fully enlightened. And obviously, it doesn't get everybody fully enlightened. Even people who really sincerely try as hard as they can, even most of them don't become fully enlightened. But maybe you could say that's because the people are incomplete and not that Buddhism is incomplete. But then again, Buddhism is created by people. Buddhism is created by incomplete people. And you can say that, well, the Buddha was enlightened, but then again, Buddhism, this enlightened teaching, is passing through the filters of generations of monks who are not enlightened. A lot of them are just like scholars and like politicians and so forth. So any human institution is going to be corrupt and to some degree foolish, and Buddhism is no exception. Not that I'm saying that Buddhism is particularly foolish, but it's just unavoidable because we're dealing with human beings. So, I guess you could say that it's incomplete, but as religions go, it's about as complete as you're going to find. So, So I guess I better just move on to the next one because we've already been going for more than an hour, and I still got several questions to go, although we're well over halfway done here. So I hope you went pee when I told you to. Told you. Okay, next question is from Brian. Here is the question I was wondering about. I knew from events at a local Buddhist temple that some of the Theravada monks only eat before midday. Some of them. Some Buddhists from different groups visit for an annual event they have, so I was wondering if the monks tend to eat only one meal a day or whether they would have a breakfast as well. I thought you might know from your experience. I don't know if you have answered this before in other videos, but I guess you could put that in one of your videos in case others are interested in the answer. Also, do you think they have the same number of calories as lay people and non-Buddhists, but just in one meal or two meals, or do you think they are managing on less? Okay, let's talk about Buddhist eating habits. In the texts, it does indicate that a monk eats one meal a day, always between dawn and midday. Although it was allowed, even in ancient times, for a monk to drink yagu, which originally, I'm pretty sure, was just the water drained off of boiling rice. Like in the morning, the ladies would boil their rice, and then they just pour off the extra water. And some mendicants, ascetics, would go around begging for that. They'd just drink that. And then from that, it got turned into like rice gruel and porridge. And it kind of troubles me a little bit that he said some of the Theravada monks only eat before midday, when that's just strictly prohibited. Monks just aren't supposed to eat after midday. But nowadays, most Asian monks eat twice a day, which is they eat the dawn meal, the ayon son, and then they eat the nei son, which is the right before midday. So they'll eat like right after dawn, and then they'll eat like around 11 a.m. So they'll get 2 meals in. Although when I was a monk, I just ate once a day for 30 years with very, very few exceptions. And so I guess I should move on to the next part here. Do you think that they have the same number of calories as lay people, but just in one meal, or do you think they are managing on less? It depends on the monk. I mean, like when you're eating just one meal a day, you're eating an entire day's supply of food in one sitting. And yeah, it's like your stomach kind of expands. You can really pack it away. So I would say that monks that aren't practicing a lot of meditation, and they're not just sitting all the time, they're probably eating, about the same amount as the average person, except just in one big meal instead of in 2 or 3 small ones. But if you're doing like intensive practice, then you can get away with way less food than usual and way less sleep than usual, just because you're in a more subtle state. You're in a way you're more your vibe is more refined or something, and you don't need so much energy to keep you going. So that's possible too, but that's probably the exception to the rule, because most monks really aren't. They're not cultivating like really subtle, refined mental states. Unfortunately, I mean that's their duty. But Asian monks especially are they're like village priests, like I was saying earlier, and a lot of them. I mean, they tend to be good people, but there's a difference between being a good person and a good monk, because they don't really they're not really following along. It's sort of like Christians in the West. I mean, what Christians do and what the Bible says Christians should do is pretty radically different in a lot of cases. So I think I'll just move on to the next question from Nardi. And Nardi says, have you ever tried contemplation of sensations? I'm doing this meditation these days. Do you have any advice on this technique? Yes, it's called Vedananupassana. It's one of the 4 satipatthanas. And yeah, you can say that sensations and mental states are there's so much overlap that they're practically synonymous, because you can have mental sensations too. But like as a general rule, when I would do anapana or meditation on breathing, I would just turn that into Vedananupassana and just focus my attention on the touch of wind on my upper lip or around my nostrils. I wouldn't be thinking breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, or following the air or anything like that. I would just be noting the sensation of touch of the wind on my upper lip. And yeah, walking meditation is the same. If I do walking meditation, it's usually either a mantra of Om, which man, I must have been a Hindu in a past life, because it happens automatically a lot. Or else just the sensations of your legs swinging, like the oily sensation in your knees, the pressure on the bottoms of your feet, that kind of a thing. That's all sensation. And it's good. It's a good thing to meditate on, because it's it's there, and it's pretty obvious, and it's easy to keep your attention focused on that. And even when you're just being mindful, I mean, usually it's sensations that you're being mindful of. Like you can be talking to somebody, and you can just be focusing your attention on the movements of your mouth, and like the vibration of your throat, and just the sensation of hearing your own voice and the other person's voice. Is everything can be turned into meditation of sensations, pretty much. So yeah, it's a good meditation. It's you're closer to ultimate reality by contemplating sensations than through conceptualizing. Like with regard to anapana, you're closer to ultimate reality by just being aware of the sensation of touch than you are by thinking breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, because then that's just like ideas, it's concepts. There is no ultimate reality of breathing in, breathing out. But at least according to Abhidhamma, there is an ultimate reality of sensation. So, good luck with your practice. It is a good way to meditate. And you could probably pick up more advice just on a book on Satipatthana. Just look up the Vedananupassana part, and it will explain a lot. I hope, if it's a good book. So the next question is by the Marquis de Sadu. And the Marquis says, "Greetings from Scandinavia. As a new Buddhist practitioner, there are some concepts that I find some difficulty in understanding fully. For example, when considering kamma, can killing be morally justifiable if the act itself comes from a place of love?" Well, it sounds like Charlie Manson. Say in certain cases of euthanasia or killing for the purpose of protecting yourself or your loved ones. Okay, that's fair enough. That's a fair question. But the thing is, as I keep saying, I just harp away at this, that whether the ethical quality of an action depends on your mental states, and especially on your cetana, or your urge, your will, your volition. And so killing from the Buddhist point of view is like the worst thing you can do. Personally, I think torturing would be worse than killing, but from Buddha's point of view of traditional ancient Indian Buddhist ethics, killing is like about the worst thing that the ordinary person can do. And so we're dealing again with shades of gray. So if you kill somebody like the Marquis is talking about here, like euthanasia, like let's say the cat gets hit by a car and it's all messed up, and so you take out the pistol and just put it out of its misery. Typical example. That would have some unskillful karma because you are knowingly killing another being, but there would be mitigating circumstances. I mean, it could be it's certainly going to be much lighter gray than if you just shoot the bastard just for fun or because you hate cats or something. So, yeah, so if you're killing, there's going to be consequences. If you're knowingly killing, even if it's through some idea of benevolence, or putting somebody out of their misery or protecting yourself or your loved ones, even so, you're still killing, and there's always going to be a certain amount of unskillful or unwholesome karma involved. But the more benevolent your motives are, the lighter gray it's going to be ethically. So protecting yourself or your loved ones. A monk is allowed to strike out in self-defense, but he's not supposed to have the intention of killing while doing so. And he would be parajika and excommunicated for life, even if he knowingly killed somebody in self-defense. You can strike out in self-defense and kill them accidentally. That wouldn't be excommunicatable, but if that is a word. And with regard to protecting loved ones, that's one reason why monks just do not have families. That's one of the reasons why it was set up that way, that monks they don't marry, they don't have children, that kind of a thing, because then you've got these obligations. Like the ordinary person, if you're married and have kids, and somebody's trying to kill them or rape them or kidnap them or something, then you're totally justified in just blowing their head off, just doing whatever it takes to protect your family. You've got a duty, like as a parent or as a husband or whatever. But that's one reason why monks they don't have families, because they're karmic minimalists. And so if you're living in the world, sometimes you have to do some ethically gray actions, and it's just the way it is. And so you got to be man enough to face the consequences, or woman enough. So in answer to the question, again, it depends on your mental states. When you're killing knowingly, there's always going to be at least a certain amount of unskillful karma. Even if you've got the best reasons in the world, still you're knowingly killing somebody, and everyone's kind of connected in a certain way, and the effect's going to be there by knowingly killing or knowingly causing suffering to another. But again, if you think you have benevolent reasons, if you think that you're causing less suffering than if you didn't do it, there would be more suffering, then it's light gray, arguably. But the thing is, from a Buddhist point of view, just to sit there and watch somebody shoot 100 people, that's ethically neutral because you personally aren't doing anything. Just to sit there and do nothing is karmically and ethically neutral. At least, I mean, especially if you're just doing nothing mentally. But yeah, I think I'll just move on to the next one. Also from the Marquee. Do you have any advice on how to create a daily spiritual routine for a layperson with prayer, meditation, etc.? How does the daily spiritual practice for a common Burmese layperson look like? I sincerely thank you for your answers and wish you all the best. Well, thank you. I wish the same to you. The thing is, I've never been a particularly religious person. I was more philosophical than religious. I never really liked ceremonies and rituals very much. That's one reason why I became a Theravada Buddhist monk, because they had about the minimum number of ceremonies and rituals. And the ceremonies were just pragmatic for obvious reasons. You weren't worshiping anything really. At least those ones weren't required in the texts. Although the culture has come up with all kinds of bowing and chanting and stuff. But daily spiritual routine, well, you should have some meditation in there. Maybe meditation when you get up, meditation before you go to bed. Read Buddhist texts, do a little study. That was one thing I used to do as a layperson, is just read a few verses of the Dhammapada right before going to sleep. If you want, you can have an altar. You can make offerings at the altar, just light a candle, burn some incense, maybe sit in front of the altar when you meditate. Of course, for a Buddhist layperson, keeping 5 precepts is pretty basic. The average Burmese layperson, a lot of them, like on the Uposatha days, which is the full moon day, new moon day, and half moon days, they will go to the monastery and keep 8 precepts. They'll keep extra precepts, which includes not eating afternoon, no singing, dancing, playing music, watching entertainment shows, just like beautifying yourself through cosmetics and garlands and using perfume, scents and that kind of a thing. They stop that, and also they sleep on a mat on the floor, just a very low, small bed. So yeah, if you've got like a monastery or a temple somewhere nearby, you could incorporate regular visits and maybe offering food to the monks or offering other things that they need. But it should fit your personality. And I think what I've just said would be like basics. And if there's other things you like to do, like chanting, you can learn chants. Some of them are really nice. Metta Sutta is very nice. Mangala Sutta is very nice. You could use a mala, like a rosary. There's all sorts of things you can do, and you should experiment and find out what works well for you. What makes you feel the happiest, because that's the point of it. And yeah, good luck with that. And the next question is from Chaplin. When can we expect your 4th book to come out? I really enjoyed the first 3. Well, that's kind of a good question. I do have 2 more books worth of material that I could edit and turn into books fairly easily. Although right now I'm pretty much pushed to my limits with regard to work and getting other stuff done when I'm not working. I'm still not fully adjusted to being a manual laborer, and so I come home pretty tired. And I had to take a little bit of a nap even before doing this video, because I had to work today. And I come home tired, and I got other stuff to do. I got to make my lunch for the next day usually if my sweetheart doesn't do it for me. And sometimes I got to clean up and I wash dishes and other things. I got to correspond with people, all sorts of things. So right now I just pretty much don't have the time to edit the 4th book, but it's there in nascent form, and it's a matter of time before I do it. It's like the first 3 are actually increasing in sales lately, so who knows? Maybe there'll be like a demand for the fourth book, in which case I'll find the time. So yeah, that's when. And the next question from Chaplin is, will you be publishing your translations? Well, actually, I've already published most of my translations in volume 1. The first book that was mentioned, which I happen to have right here. Shamelessly plugging my own book. So most of my translations are in this book, which is available on Amazon.com. And for the person above who was asking good books to read to learn about Buddhism, I mean, it's not systematic. It's not really like a step-by-step explanation of Buddhism, but it has a lot of aspects of Buddhism that you're not going to find anywhere else, or not together in one book anyway. So most of my translations from Pali into English are, as I say, in this book. And there's one other book that I have written back in the 90s, the first published book I ever wrote, which is this one, the Atagawaga Translation. And this one, I mean, I've always wanted to make an edition of this that would be compact, like maybe half this size, that you could carry in your pocket, maybe even on waterproof paper, like some field guides are made. So, I mean, you could just take it everywhere, just carry it in your pocket. You sit down on a hill out in the woods or something, and you just pull it out and you just read a sutta. That was always my vision. But this book, I've always had the idea that it should never be sold for money. I just want this to be Dhamma Dana, just for free distribution. So someday, maybe if there's enough demand, or just some wealthy, eccentric person comes along who wants to publish an edition of this, yeah, I would make it, but it would have to be for free distribution. I don't want to charge money for it, because the Dhamma is priceless. It should be freely available to all beings. So, the last person to ask questions is Diane. And she asks 2 questions. The first of which is it possible for my dog to be reincarnated? And the answer is yes. In fact, going with Buddhist philosophy, all beings continue to be reborn. They go through the cycle of birth and death and rebirth and redeath until eventually they become enlightened. So yeah, dog can be reincarnated. And when I was a kid, we had a dog that was so human in certain ways. I used to think sometimes it was possible that maybe it was even a human being that in a past life, and I don't know, it just liked fighting or something too much, and had to be reborn as a dog or something. But yeah, and I've come across the idea a few times in Buddhist philosophy of just the weird karma that results in like really like pampered dogs in the West. Like a Burmese village dog. It really is a lower realm. Like in Buddhism, the animal realm is like, it's a lower realm. It's a realm that you don't want to be born into. But some dogs in the West, they've got it made. They've got it way better than a lot of people in the East, or a lot of people in the West for that matter. So yeah, going with Buddhist philosophy, your dog, not only is it possible, but it's pretty much inevitable that your dog will be reborn. And I remember reading a very strange book called Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts, who's channeling this multi-dimensional being that calls itself Seth. And Seth had this really interesting idea that like the karmic stream of a being can split. And Seth was saying that just in the recent past, a part of his karma had split off and become a dog, and had just started a whole new like a reincarnational channel, like this whole new being. And that's not Orthodox Buddhism, but it would explain why the number of beings just remains infinite in the universe. And it's where new beings can come to replace the beings that finally make it off the wheel. But I digress. And so Diane's last question. This is the very last question. Diane asks, how do traditional Buddhists, say in Southeast Asia, view the paranormal, like spirits and PK manifestations we see on shows like The Dead Files? Well, yeah, if you go to Burma, it's very real there, much more real than in the West. Just for starters, you've got some monks who presumably have psychic powers, especially with regard to reading minds. You know, they'll just look right through you, and they can answer your questions before you ask them. Also, the Burmese very much believe in ghosts, so much that a lot of them are just afraid to pass through a cemetery unless they're with a group of people. And also witches. There's a saying in Burma that every seventh house has a witch living there. So yeah, I mean the paranormal, it's just accepted as just ordinary existence in the West, in the East. I mean, like in Southeast Asia. So yeah, so it's just very valid. It's accepted more than it is in the West. Like a lot of people in the West don't believe in ghosts, but I think probably most people in Southeast Asia would believe in ghosts, and lots of other things, monsters of all sorts, all kinds of things, dragons and ogres and all sorts of things. Like for example, when I was a monk, still a relatively junior monk, I was going to live in a certain forest, and one of my best friends at the time was a monk who came from that part of Burma in the south. And he had a degree in physics. I think he was a high school mathematics teacher. He was reasonably intelligent. But even so, he was warning me, you got to be careful. There's a dragon there, and there's like this powerful spirit that lives in this hill. And I mean, you can't spit on the ground there. It doesn't like that. And there's ogres. There's like this army of them. And I mean, they're very territorial. Don't try to set up your own territory there because they'll attack you. And they just accept this stuff without question. So yeah, it's part of their reality. It's not just so much like an interesting hobby of watching the shows and thinking, that's interesting, because for them it's just reality. And that's the last question. So as always, so long as people keep asking questions, I will keep attempting to answer them. So just keep them coming. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to put them in the comments below. Or if you are subscribed to my Subscribe Star channel, you can put them there, especially when I leave an announcement for an upcoming Q&A. Or if you're on the Discord server associated with Subscribe Star channel, then you can leave them in the Q&A room also. And with regard to the books that have been mentioned a few times, I shamelessly plug them, and the links on Amazon should be in the URL links below the video. And ask about whatever you think I can answer, like especially Buddhist history, Buddhist philosophy, meditation, that kind of thing, Southeast Asia, monasticism in general, anything like that. And be happy.